The landscape of video games is radically different in each decade. The 70s gave us Pong, in the 80s Nintendo's stock rose with Donkey Kong, the 90s saw PlayStation arrive, the noughties, I hate that term, gave us Xbox and Steam, and however you refer to this decade that we're in at the moment has given us the PS4, the Xbox One, and the Switch. So right off the bat, let me quickly clarify something. This list isn't meant to victimize or say one generation of game enthusiasts is superior to another, but as when I try and talk to my 14-year-old brother about the woes of memory card loss while he's chugging Monster Energy drink and playing GTA Online, it seemed high time to assemble a list of these quirks. Let's educate the youths, shall we? I'm Ben from What Culture, and here are 10 things today's gamers wouldn't understand. Number 10. When fog was unintentional. If fog closed in on you now in some slick Unreal Engine-powered AAA title, you'd naturally assume it was intentional, part of the atmosphere, and perhaps designed to increase the difficulty of a section. A couple of decades ago, however, you'd tend to find yourself wrapped up in ever-present mist. A hallmark of early N64 titles, fog was the colloquial term for a technical limitation of the day that saw some games suffer from an incredibly short draw distance. The upshot of this was that you often couldn't see too far ahead of where you were going and were forced to wander around lost for ages. Turok Dinosaur Hunter, we're looking at you. Number 9. When we all talked in bit. It's hard to put an exact date on when this practice stopped, but if you ever played in the 90s, you'll be familiar with the idea that discussions of video game graphics were restricted to talking about bit. If you were stuck with a Master System, then too bad, buddy. It may well have Alex Kidd built in, but it was sadly an 8-bit console and everyone else had a 16-bit Super Nintendo. They would then salivate over the promise of the 32-bit Saturn until Sony came along and ruined everything. After the N64, all the bit stuff seemed to stop. No one spoke of the 128-bit Dreamcast or the 256-bit Xbox 360, and the world was poorer for it. Number 8. When Disney games were good. Film tie-in games are woeful 99% of the time, and Disney have provided few exceptions to that rule, but it hasn't always been this way, as you'll know if you had a Sega Mega Drive in the early 90s. Back in those happier times, some of the very best games were made by Disney. Admittedly, saying Disney themselves used to make good games is misleading. After all, the likes of Castle of Illusion starring Mickey Mouse, its sequel World of Illusion, Quackshot, and decent film tie-ins like Aladdin and The Lion King were often made in-house by Sega, but they were some of the best platformers of the day and remain among the best uses of Disney's licensing. Number 7. When Sonic and Mario were enemies. They're more likely to be palling around at the Olympic Games than coming to blows now, but there was a time when Mario would have become physically sick if you even mentioned Sonic the Hedgehog in his presence. So great was their mutual disgust. The mascots of two gaming empires, you were Sega or you were Nintendo, or at least that's how it was for kids in the early 90s. These days, the more open-minded of us are happy to flitter between Microsoft, Sony and Nintendo as and when it suits us, but back then, the line in the sand was drawn and there was no man's land. Number 6. When Rare were the best ever. Today, British video game studio Rare are a subsidiary of Microsoft and are consigned to making depressingly crap nonsense, but they used to make some of the finest video games on planet Earth. They are best remembered for their days working for Nintendo, notably in the N64 era, where they released Banjo-Kazooie, Diddy Kong Racing, and Blast Corps, as well as film tie-in GoldenEye 007. But even before then, Rare made the brilliant Battletoads, Killer Instinct, and the seminal Donkey Kong Country titles that defined the SNES. It's safe to say that Rare today exists in name only, which is really sad, but just try to remember the good times. At least some of them went on to make Time Splitters. So there's that. Number 5. When you had to visit the arcade to see amazing graphics. It was only really with Sega's fondly remembered Dreamcast that the arcade quality graphics came into the home, with perfect conversions of House of the Dead 2 and Crazy Taxi. Even though the Mega Drive laid claim to arcade quality graphics and sound, the likes of Altered Beast and Golden Axe were poor cousins to their Leviathan coin-op counterparts. It's all changed now though. Visit most arcades in the UK and you'll find the same creaky units that were there 20 years ago, and even if they do have a more recent game, it won't look as good as Uncharted 4, will it? Indeed, today you could walk into an arcade with a perfect port of Sega Rally running on your iPad and show it to the man who works there as he tries to sell you tokens. He'll cry and you'll feel bad. Why did you go to the arcade today, James? Is it because you're a monster? Maybe. We'll never know. Number 4. When the dog would fall over the controller lead. Admittedly, people did it just as regularly, but until recent times, people would often walk in front of video game players and into the outstretched lead of a controller, either A, yanking said controller from the player's unsuspecting hands, or B, sending the console flying off the shelf. The original Xbox of 2002 tried to solve this problem prior to the invention of wireless controllers by ingeniously making it so that the first thing to give in the event of a human-animal controller cable collision was the lead itself, which would detach into 2 pieces, sparing everyone the bother of a fun shouting match about whose fault the smashed console was. Always your fault for having the tenacity to be using a controller or just be alive, incidentally, according to my mum anyway. Number 3. When blowing the cartridge was the solution. While one would assume this ended with the fall of the last cartridge-based home console, the N64, they'd be wrong, as Nintendo's handheld offerings are keeping the dream alive. For example, I can't remember the amount of times I had to blow into my Game Boy Color cartridge slot when Pokemon Blue wouldn't load, and admittedly, it was certainly a far more common practice in the age preceding CDs, though. If a game cartridge didn't seem to want to work, the user would retrieve it from the console, turn it upside down, bring it to their lips, and blow into it. Why? Who knows, it was just the done thing. Was it getting rid of dust, cooling it down? Regardless, it seemed to work. I once had to take T-Cut, used to remove scratches from car paint, by the way, to my copy of SmackDown Here Comes the Pain because it was so scratched. It worked, but wouldn't exhaling into the PS2 have been the preferred method? I think it would bring back the cartridges. Number 2. When you had to use MS-DOS prompt. Back in the Windows 95 era, it wasn't uncommon to encounter slightly older DOS-based games which would require you to faff about with them to make them work. Anyone who wanted to play Theme Park, TIE Fighter, Discworld, Monkey Island, and Little Big Adventure would have bad memories of going through the MS-DOS prompt and typing things like D install or C.tie.exe or something to try and get things to run. It could be a complete nightmare, and usually it required outside help and not Google. In those days, there was an incredibly high chance that any PC game you bought wouldn't work, and you'd have no idea why. Number 1. Split-screen logistical nightmares. First, some background. In the late 90s, playing a 4-player game, for example GoldenEye 007, had its drawbacks. With all the action divided into 4 sections on one TV, each player was able to see what everyone else on the screen was doing. It was an inherent flaw in gameplay back then. However, many fond memories of playing with mates in the same room you may retain nonetheless. Gaming magazines used to frequently run stories about nerds who went through a lot of hassle to play 4-player split-screen games split over 4 separate TVs so each player could plot bloody murder in private. Today you just set up a LAN if you want to get serious about this, or more likely you just scrap the cables and play online together. But the 1997 solution for the hardcore was mad. Are you ready? Some bizarre sections of society actually did the following. You had to first purchase a 4-way splitter cable that allowed you to plug the N64 into 4 TVs, then you had to use tape and cardboard to black out the other player's 3 portions of each TV, just leaving one small segment to yourself. Completely bonkers. And that's our list. Make sure you subscribe to the What Culture Gaming YouTube channel for more lists like this, and don't forget to visit whatculture.com for daily news and articles. I'm Ben from What Culture, and thanks for watching.